American Eugenics and its Influence on Nazi Germany. It all started with a Brit named Sir Francis Galton. He was the younger half-cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton was born in 1822 to a Quaker family famous for gun manufacturing and banking. That seems a little odd, doesn't it? This was also the same year as Gregor Mendel's birth, and 13 years after the birth of Charles Darwin. This left little Galton sandwiched between two scientific giants. So nobody loved him, and he lived in the shadows of medicine. It was obvious that Darwin would be destined for a life of science. But for Galton, it wasn't as obvious. He was a child prodigy, and he was eventually pushed into studying medicine by his parents. Maybe we should actually blame them for causing the Holocaust. In 1859, Galton read Darwin's The Origin of Species, leaving him both envious and proud of his older cousin's research. He was heavily influenced by his famous half-cousin. In 1883, 1 year after Darwin's death, he published Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development. In this sensational book, he laid out a grand plan for improving the human race. He wanted to mimic natural selection and accelerate the process of refining humans via human intervention. I bet you can guess where this is heading. Looking for a term for his new strategy, he coined the word eugenics. This word combines the Greek prefix eu, for good, with genesis, the Greek word for beginning or origin. Everyone has heard the term nature versus nurture. Guess what? Our buddy Galton coined that, too. He believed genius was in our DNA, and he attempted to prove it. He published all of this in a rambling and incoherent book called Hereditary Genius. His role model, Darwin, read it and found it foolish. Never attempted another genealogical study. Instead, it led to his obsession that specific human mating patterns, using the best candidates, could control the variance in the gene pool. Another scientist, Batesman, proved Galton wrong, and once again he suffered a blow to his ego. This time, however, he defended himself, unlike when he shrank away from Darwin's feedback. Remaining indifferent to the research of coherent and highly esteemed scientists, Galton decided in 1904 to present an argument for eugenics. Now this is where it gets a little creepy. He suggested that eugenics needed to be introduced into the national consciousness, like a new religion. Using Darwin's concept of natural selection, he turned it into the foundation for something evil. Through eugenics, Galton wanted to weed out undesirable human traits, much like one would breed dogs. Marriages between people with undesirable genetics would be banned. Many criticized Galton's lecture and pointed out the weakness of his argument. For example, perfectly normal parents can produce schizophrenic children, and sickly people can be geniuses, such as the case with his very own cousin, Charles Darwin. This doesn't change the fact that Galton hated the idea of short, poor, brutish, and ugly British people walking around and taking over the country. Now notice how only 2 of those attributes are actually related to genetics. Unfortunately, a few people caught on to Galton's flawed ideas and thought the process of eugenics should be accelerated. In 1911, Galton's colleague Havelock Ellis twisted Mendel's research into a euphemism for sterilization. Basically, if Mendel only allowed certain pea plants with desirable traits to reproduce, why not do the same thing with humans? Although Galton felt uncomfortable with using sterilization to control reproduction, he couldn't stop Ellis from running away with the idea. Galton died in 1911. In 1912, the first international conference on eugenics was held, and it gathered people from Germany, Britain, and the United States. It was at this conference that the German scientist Alfred Plowitz discussed launching a racial cleansing effort in Germany. This was followed by an even larger and more ambitious talk by Bleecker van Wagenen. an American from Harvard. If eugenics was just a concept in Germany and Britain in 1912, it was actually a full operation in the United States. Van Wagenen had issues with Americans who were epileptics, criminals, deaf, and visually impaired. These unlucky people were either packed away into colonies or involuntarily sterilized. By 1912, 8 states had legalized sterilization and were already sterilizing those seen as unfit to reproduce. Let's take a look at a nice example of 2 women who were hauled off. There once was a woman named Emma Buck. She was married to a man named Frank Buck and lived a relatively normal, impoverished American life. It's unclear what happened to Frank, but we know by 1920 Emma was alone to raise her daughter Carrie. As I mentioned, they lived in poverty and often relied on the generosity of others. Eventually, Emma was caught on the streets and arrested, likely for prostitution. 2 doctors diagnosed her as feeble-minded and sent her off to the women's colony. This left little Carrie, who otherwise lived a normal childhood, alone with no family. So, as is typical, she was sent to the foster care system, which wasn't too much better back then either. Carrie was raped by a member of her foster family and got pregnant. Embarrassed, the foster family had their friend, who also happened to be a judge, determined that Carrie was feeble-minded like her biological mother. She too was then sent off to the colony. There, Carrie had a daughter named Vivian. Even the baby was classified as a moron and confined to the colony. By 1927, the United States was flooded with European immigrants, which further increased paranoia among eugenics supporters. In May of that same year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that compulsory vaccination could include sterilization by cutting the fallopian tubes of women. Carrie Buck was sterilized at the young age of 21. Her only crime was being born in poverty. State-supported sterilization was now in full swing in the United States. Do you still want the government in control of your health care? Europe watched the United States closely with envy and amazement at how successful Americans were with pushing sterilization on the population. Hitler didn't rise to power until 1933, but while he was jailed for a failed takeover attempt in Munich during the 1920s, this law was closely modeled after the American Eugenics program, but it stepped it up a notch and allowed for the sterilization of anyone suffering from a hereditary disease. Hitler thought about ways to move from sterilization to outright murder, and seized this wonderful opportunity. By 1943, the Nazi Party had sterilized 400,000 people and killed 250,000 men, women, and children. Eventually, as we know, the Germans went down a slippery slope that led to the deaths of 6 million Jews, 200,000 gypsies, and millions of Soviet and Polish citizens. We don't even know how many homosexuals, writers, political dissidents, and artists were killed in Germany.